I appreciate the opportunity to address you. I thank you for the invitation. My talk's a little bit different than what you've been hearing because I'm a surgeon, transplant surgeon. I actually was the first woman to ever do a liver transplant. Now I do liver transplants, kidney transplants. I do the live donors for liver, and I also was a kidney donor. So I have very strong feelings about this topic. I also am president of the Transplantation Society, and I want to tell you about trafficking and problems that we have with cheating in transplantation. I also want to give you some reflection on what motivation exists, because I think that was part of the charge that you gave us. But I feel like I need to give you an education in medicine, show you some national examples of success and failures in controlling bad practices in transplantation, tell you some of our international efforts, because the Transplantation Society is an international association, and then end with our combined approach to combating some of these problems. In 2004, this was the cover of the New York Times Science section. I don't know how many of you read it, but at that point we celebrated the 50th year of solid organ transplantation, and now we're 64 years. So our field relative to the lawyers in the room or the judges in the room is very young, and gives you some perspective. Now, the Transplantation Society has been in existence for 50 of those 64 years, and we have a very strong opposition statement to the buying and selling of organs, the commercialization of organs. And in fact, every single country in the world has a prohibition in the commercialization of organs. Now, that has not stopped organ trafficking, and that's really what we're going to talk about. This is a timeline of transplantation activities, and the first successful transplant was a kidney done in Boston. But you can see this was done on the background of a lot of legislative efforts. And transplant really was fostered in the US because of two things. First, the Social Security Department decided that if you had end-stage kidney disease, you would be supported. Whether or not it was hemodialysis or transplantation, you would be supported. And then the other major event that happened in the US was this AMA Congress on brain death. So that was very important in setting the stage for who was going to be a donor and who not. And you can see the development of other organ transplants, liver, heart, and most recently face transplantation. And what did they call this? A chip for the public? Don't get sick. I know you've had your breakfast, but this is kind of the community of transplantation. This is the woman from Lyon who received a face transplant, recently died last year because of chronic rejection. This is us doing a liver transplant. You can see the whole, this is what we do, unlike what you guys do. So, Franny Moore, who is very important, he was the chief when the first transplant was done in Boston. He was very thoughtful about our moral obligations as surgeons, and I think it's important for you to understand our moral background. The problem is once we take on live donor transplant, in this case it was kidney, we have to think not just of the recipient and how to help the recipient, but we have a second patient, and that's the donor. So that adds to the complexity and actually is part of this notion of equipoise. We have to consider the risk-benefit to the donor, the risk-benefit to the recipient, and the risk-benefit to the rest of the patients who are waiting on the transplant list. So these are all important issues. Now, there's no question that transplant itself is the optimal therapy for patients with end-stage organ disease. In fact, it is the preferred therapy for patients with kidney failure because it is a cheaper, more effective way to care for these patients. They have improved survival, and they have better quality of life. Similar is true for liver transplantation. But so there's deceased donors are a rare resource. They are, that depends on the altruism of the public, and it dictates that there is a fair and transparent method of distributing these organs. Increasingly, people need the live donors as a source for organs too. And so in the live donor, we worry about their health, but we also worry about them being exploited. And that is a recurrent theme in transplantation. So the bottom line is we think that all countries need legislative systems that ensure the optimal conditions for donation, both deceased and live, and human organ transplantation. Now you ask us, so this is a summary of the transplant activity done around the world in 2014. So about 120,000 solid organ transplants done. If you actually look at the burden of disease across the world, this represents less than 10% of the transplants needed. So ischemic heart disease is the most common cause of death in civilized community, in developed countries, diabetes, end-stage liver disease, end-stage kidney disease. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of what we need. It has also been estimated that of these 120,000 transplants, 10% of them were done illegally. So at least 10%, because this is what's reported. There may be many more done illegally. This is data from the United States. The top line in blue are the patients who are awaiting solid organ transplants as of last year. So 120,000 people are waiting, more than 130,000 people are waiting, and you can see that we just do around 35,000 transplants. So we are not meeting our own needs. Now, of the patients waiting for heart transplants, they will die without transplants. The patients waiting for liver will die without transplants. 30% of them will die. And the patients who are waiting for kidney, about 20% of them die. So these are desperate patients. And we certainly understand the motivation for the patients to seek alternatives through other channels. But we have to think about the motivation of the hospitals and the surgeons too, and the doctors too. So this is what we feel the government can do for organ transplants. We need to have brain death legislation. In Japan, it took years and years and years for them to develop brain death legislation, and that's why their transplant activities, although they started out fantastic, have lagged beyond the rest of the countries. Korea is much further ahead than Japan. They need to establish organ procurement units. Somebody's got to go out and get the organs. They need to certify transplant centers. Is my center doing transplants in a professional, a way that meets the standards? They need to establish tissue banks and organ banks. They need to establish how to identify when somebody is brain dead. It's not enough to have a law that describes brain death. You've got to actually teach people how to make that diagnosis. They have to prohibit the unethical transplant practices, paid donation, trafficking, our approach to foreigners, and I'm going to show you some data. They have to establish registries. That's so important. We have to know who the donors are, who the recipients are, and what happens after transplant. In fact, in Europe, you do not have post-transplant registries. It's amazing to me, but you actually don't have a good handle on how your patients are doing after transplant. So every single country in the world has areas for improvement. Now, you might say to me, well, what's the matter with you scientists? Why can't you develop alternatives to solid organ transplant? Now, we have machines, and people can get out of the hospital if they have a mechanical heart, but that's a temporary solution in terms of weeks or months or years. We don't have an alternative for liver or kidney where people are independent of machines. Now, this is a prototype of a machine that an implantable kidney that we're developing at my institution, but we're some years away of this becoming reality. Now, you could also say to us, you guys are smart, why don't you develop alternatives? Why don't you use other organs? And in fact, if you're aware of what's going on in science, you will know that the CRISPR technology, that is the ability to actually take away potentially harmful viruses and put on human antigens on pig cells, has the potential to give us a source, an unlimited source of pig donor organs. And in fact, this technology is advanced enough so that it's likely that a trial will start with pig kidney in the United States in the next year. I said a trial, though, because we really don't know what's going to happen with this in the long term. So there's only two sources. We're dependent on human organs, and you can either have live donor or you can have deceased donor. And this slide shows you the activity for kidney transplantation, and these are countries of the world. And you can see that in Western countries in general, in green, we use deceased donor transplants, and in Eastern places where they have less developed transplantation, but increasingly they're developing, they use live donor transplants. So live donor, even though it sounds more complicated, and because you have 2 patients, in fact is a little bit easier for new transplant centers to start. This is the data for liver, and again, you see the same thing. The Western countries on your right are using deceased donors in large part, and then the Eastern countries, except like Egypt, Turkey, they are using live donors. And we're trying to use a combination of both types of donors, but each type of donor has problems. So the appeal of live donation is that it's easy. You've got 2 patients right there. You can do the transplant tomorrow. The kidneys tend to be excellent. The kidneys or livers tend to be excellent. You know the history of the donor. You have better outcomes sometimes if the donor's relation. You need less immunosuppression. And outside of Western countries, it has been the answer to the lack of cadaver organs. The concern, of course, is that the donors will be exploited. The concern is donor health, but also that the donors will be exploited. And you've seen the photos. These are donors from Pakistan who have decided to sell their organs, sell their kidney, and that's the kidney incision that you see on their sides, sell their kidneys for an amount of money. Now, there is one country. So this is the order for kidney transplant. There are certain countries that supply the donors. So Pakistan, Mexico, the Philippines. Then there are other, and the typical kidney donor is a young male, a worker. He may be uneducated. The typical recipient is a well-to-do man, usually from Western countries, the US, Israel, the UK, and there's a big disparity in the age of the recipient and the donor, and these wealthy white men are actually buying the organs from those Pakistani males that you saw in the last slide. Now, there is one country in the world that actually has a law that allows the use of paid donors, and that's Iran. So we all look to Iran to see if this process can work. There are a lot of people in the United States who suggest that we should pay for organs too, because that would meet the needs that we have. So Iran actually took a very well-considered approach to paid donation. First of all, they limited it to people, both donors and recipients, who were from Iranian heritage. So that's very important. They limited it. They didn't want foreign nationals coming. Second, the donor had to be willing, the donor had to be fit, the donor had to be greater than 18. There weren't any contraindications. The recipient team could not be conflicted and choose the donor had to be chosen independently. But the donor also needed to be followed up in the long run to make sure that that donor was cared for medically after donation. So it all sounds fantastic, doesn't it? But in fact, what happened is that the use of the paid donors, which is shown in the lighter blue color, has increased, but the number of related family donors has decreased. So this opportunity to pay someone to do your work made it so that I didn't want to donate to my sister if I lived in Iran. But more important than that, we have to look at what happened to those paid donors. So there have been a number of questionnaires. Early on, there was a questionnaire when they thought the system was working. They asked the donors, would you do this again? 85% of them said they wouldn't donate again. They felt that it caused conflicts at home. It affected their health. 94% of them were unwilling to be known as donors. So they were ashamed that they were donors. And it did not help their financial situation. Now, more recently, they tried to follow up these donors. They sent questionnaires to almost 400 donors who underwent the surgery between 2000 and 2012, and they only were able to locate 60 of the donors, which means that those donors were not being followed up. So, we can close our eyes and our ears to the notion that paid donation is okay if you follow the donors, but if you don't follow the donors, you have no idea what's going on with them long term. And many people in Iran, particularly the large centers in Shiraz, are demanding now that the government give up doing paid donation because the experiment has not worked for them. In the Philippines, they had a giant problem with organ brokers. And so they tried the Iran method for a few years, where they had a regulated system of paying the donors. And there were pretty sizable packages that they paid the donors. Again, this system did nothing to decrease the brokers and the underground transplantation, so they gave up this system in 2008. Israel took another tact. Israel was distressed because they were largely those buyers who are going to other countries and buying organs. So they decided that they needed to have a method whereby they could increase the number of deceased donation in Israel. So they set up a system, where a three-tiered system, where they gave the most points if you had previously donated your organ to a stranger. They gave no points if you donated your organ to your sister or your brother. If you had a donor card, you got extra points, or if your relatives had donor cards, you could get extra points. So a lot of people have criticized this system because it is an exchange of valuable consideration on some hand, but the publicity associated with this system has largely increased the number of donations, deceased donations in Israel, and has increased their transplant activity. So I think that's actually been a good technique. Now, I don't want to, when we come from the United States, people say, well, you never look at yourself to see what's going on in the US. And I want to tell you some cautionary tales of the bad things that are going on in the US, but some of the good things too. So the US, we've actually increased our deceased donation, we've increased our live donation, but a way that we've increased, one of the ways that we've increased our live donation is through this kidney swap. So there's two organizations, in addition to the one that's run by the government, whereby you can actually register a patient pair, a donor and recipient pair, a live donor pair, and perhaps they are ABO incompatible, or they react against one another in the test tube, so they have positive cross-match. But you can become part of what's known as a kidney chain. So you have a donor, you donate to somebody in New York, that New Yorker's recipient donates to somebody in New Jersey, and on and on and on across the country. And the chains have been as long as 50 and 60 pairs, so it's been fantastic and has really increased live donation in the US. This is one of the companies, nonprofit companies, that has been involved with this. And you can see in 2017, they're anticipating facilitating 450 transplants. So that's pretty important, getting 450 people off dialysis. But there's something not so great going on in the US too. And this relates to deceased donations. So now we're going to talk about deceased donation a little bit. Oh, I did want to tell you about the Global Kidney Exchange. This is a recent suggestion of a Nobel Prize winner, Alvin Roth, and a surgeon in the United States, that perhaps we could trade, we could think about the swap, but think about it across countries. So we could use poor people from Mexico and bring them to the United States, and they would become part of a swap, and we would send them home with money to care for their transplants, for their post-transplant care. Many of us feel that this would, again, exploit vulnerable, poor people, and so we actually are quite opposed to the notion. But this is in public exchange. This is an argument that's going on within the transplant community, and I think that level of transparency and exchange and fighting about this is what makes us a little bit different from what I've heard these last couple of days. So I want to tell you about another kind of not so great thing that we're doing in the US. So before 2012, we were limited in how many foreign nationals we could transplant. We were limited to 5% of our transplant activity. After 2012, it was decided that there was not going to be a limit, but that there was going to be transparency. So everybody could see how many foreign nationals you were transplanting. And this NCNR refers to non-citizen, non-resident. Those are the old term was foreign nationals. So if you look at the number of foreign nationals done between 2013 and 2016, there were 1,176 foreign nationals transplanted in the US. And when you look at the number of transplants done, 99,000 transplants done, this number looks quite small. 1.2% of all our transplants are done for foreign nationals, no big deal. But if you actually look at specific programs, there are 5 kidney programs and 7 liver programs who are performing more than 5% of their transplants in foreign nationals. And this ranges for kidney between 6 and 53% of their transplants done for foreign nationals. And for liver, it ranges between 5.5% and 16%. So there's potentially a problem here. And again, it may relate to people who are well-to-do who are coming to the US to get organs. And if you look to see the country of origin of these people who are coming for transplant, it's a little bit alarming, and it will require that we look into it in more detail. So when you look for kidney, there are many people coming from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Middle Eastern countries. For liver, again, it's the same problem. So again, we've just presented this to our colleagues, and this will have to be investigated because we've got to figure out whether or not we have a systemic problem here at those centers. That's the kind of self-review, policing compliance, if you will, that we need to do within the transplantation community that I think will serve us well. Now, again, as we talk about deceased donation, perhaps the biggest scandal in the world in terms of deceased donation was the practice that existed for many years in China that was quite isolated from the rest of the transplant world. And there was the widespread use of executed prisoners for organ donation. And at one point, this may have reached some 10,000 executed prisoners and the use of their organs. And that is how transplantation developed in China. Well, the transplant community, of course, is appalled by this practice, and for many years actually wouldn't deal with China at all, but more recently has taken a different tact, and that tact is to interface with those people who want to make change in China. And we've been very gratified because we think we have, and the Transplantation Society has been at the forefront of this, Frank Delmonico, we think that we've made a giant difference here. So this man, Foo Wong, was a transplant surgeon, and he now is in charge of the transplant program in China. And he himself was the first person who actually admitted that China used executed prisoners for their organs. Now, when you saw that one of the first slides I showed you, the legislative issues that allowed transplantation to develop, it said that in 2007, China announced they were going to give up the use of executed prisoners. And they announced it again in 2011, and they announced it again in 2014. But in 2015, they gave up the use of the executed prisoners. And this man, who many people actually think is wicked, actually admitted that he himself did it, but then went about to change that practice. So in 2015, China stopped using executed prisoners in any organized way and made a number of other reforms, including the replacement. They have 1.5 billion people they have to, they have billions of people they have to serve. So they've replaced this source of donor organs with donation after cardiac death, which is one of the ways that we get deceased donors. They have prohibited transplantation of foreigners, which was a giant problem. All the people that were going to China to buy organs. They have centralized their system of organ retrieval and distribution based on need, based on Western formula, transplantation. They accredit transplant and retrieval programs. They develop registries, which is better than many other advanced countries, and they have a registry of transplant outcomes. Now, I want to talk to you about some international efforts. The Transplantation Society came together with the International Society of Nephrology and developed the Istanbul Summit in 2008 and developed the statement of the Declaration of Istanbul, which prohibits trafficking of organs. And here are some definitions for you. Transplant commercialism is the policy or practice in which an organ is treated as a commodity, including being bought or sold or used for material gain. Organ trafficking is a recruitment, transport, transferring of people or their organs by means of threat or coercion, and again, the abuse of power, position of vulnerability, control over the potential donor. This is either for money, it's for threat. Travel for transplant is the movement of organs, donors, recipients across jurisdictional borders. So if I go with my sister, if my sister is Filipino and I go there and get my transplant there, that's travel for transplant, but that's not trafficking. It may be transplant tourism if I am actually paying that person I say is my sister, or if I get a deceased donor transplant in that country and it affects their abilities to treat their own patient. Now, the problem is that no country can meet their own needs. So every time a foreigner comes and has transplant in the US, we are not meeting the needs of a transplant patient in the US. So that's a giant problem. In the Madrid Resolution in 2010 actually described what the expectation was for self-sufficiency. And the idea here is for a nation to figure out what your burden of disease is, figure out how you're going to treat patients with end-stage kidney and liver and heart disease, have enough personnel to do that, but also meet the transplant needs. And this is just a schematic of that. So this guy's really important. This is Marcelo Sorondo, and he is a chancellor. He's at the Vatican, and he's actually the chancellor of the Pontifical Association of Science in the Vatican. And he brought together a group of surgeons and doctors and legislators, judges, prosecutors, media, all together to have a conference at the Vatican in February of 2017. And we met to talk about each country had to show their data. How many patients were going out of the country to get transplanted elsewhere? How many people came into the country to get transplanted elsewhere? So this was the first time we all sat together and heard one another's data. And the judges heard it, and the religious people heard it, and the prosecutors heard it. So it was really important. The other important thing is that the chancellor convinced the Pope to consider organ trafficking a crime against humanity. And that is an important distinction in terms of prosecution. So these are the recommendations of this academy. I want to tell you that the academy met in the room that Galileo had to defend himself, so it was pretty heavy duty. That all nations recognize human trafficking for organ removal and organ trafficking, that religion should get involved. The nations should achieve self-sufficiency. The governments need to develop legal framework. Professionals need to monitor outcomes. We need registries, reporting. The judicial system has to be able to investigate. And we should not cover unethical transplants, either by insurance or government. We need professional education. And then these international associations should collect information about transplant crimes. So sitting with you guys makes me wonder about who we consider to be the criminals here. Who should we prosecute? Should we prosecute the patients? I mean, they're desperate, I told you. They feel that they're going to die without transplant, and they feel that that justifies their going anywhere in the world for a transplant. Should we prosecute the donors, the live donors? They certainly seem to be the victims here. Should we prosecute the brokers? I think we all agree with that. Should we prosecute the hospitals and the clinics? Yes. The surgeons? Yes. How about the referring doctors or the doctors who take care of the patients post-transplant? So if a patient comes to me and says, I'm in a rush to get my transplant, I say to them, I understand that it's unethical and it's dangerous for you to have transplant in the Philippines. But when that patient comes back from the Philippines or comes back from China, I take care of that patient. I admit it to you all. I feel like it's my moral obligation as a physician to care for that patient. So am I complicit in that? Many people feel like we need to think about the responsibility, of course, of the government, the country where the transplant is done. We want to hold the government of Pakistan responsible for the unethical transplants that are going on there. How about the government of the recipients? So when you talk to the surgeons in Pakistan, they want the government of the US or the government of Israel to also be responsible when people come there for their transplants. And then finally, I want to tell you just about our combined approach to unethical transplant practices. I'm sorry if I'm taking too long. We withhold membership to our national and our international organizations when we think that somebody is practicing unethical transplantation. And that's important when you talk about advancement, when you talk about the motivation of people. They want prestige. A lot of that prestige is within your own organization. We also don't allow people who are involved in unethical transplant practices to publish in our journals. In every single transplant journal, there's a prohibition. You have to sign a document that says that that the data that you're presenting comes from the ethical treatment of patients. We have now a central repository of transgressions where we hear about, a lot of this is hearsay. Somebody went, I heard yesterday, somebody went to China and actually paid to get a kidney transplant. So I called my friend in China to find out, to report it and to find out if he could get more information about it. So we interact with local key opinion leaders. We interact with national prosecutors. The national prosecutor from Israel has been particularly receptive to hearing about Israelis who go outside their country for a paid transplantation. We participate with religious leaders, and of course, the Vatican has been so fantastic in this regard. We have put transplant ethics as part of our medical school education, as part of our curriculum. And we feel like we are now starting to hold the transplant physicians, myself, when somebody comes back with a unethical transplant responsible, and we want the countries to have national accountability. So I'll end there. I'm sorry it's been such a whirlwind of slides. That's how surgeons talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Ascher, for the great and insightful speech.